Welcome to the channel, welcome to the video. Today I want to talk a little bit about multiband compression, and mainly because it's one of the things I get asked about most when working with clients, when I do coaching. And it's when to use multiband compression, or moreover, when to use multiband compression rather than dynamic EQ. So I'm going to try and tackle that. I'll give you some pointers in the right direction in this video. The way I'm going to do it is probably just to talk about one of my mixers and to just pick one channel where I've used a selection, multiple selections of both options, and talk you through why I did what I did. So first of all, let's discuss multiband compression. What is a multiband compressor? Well, a multiband compressor allows you to compress individual bands, and you set the bands, you set the range that you want to compress. And when I talk about bands, I'm talking about frequency bands. So a common technique when setting up a multiband compressor to use on anything is to select 3 or 4 bands and just to place them equally, spread them across the frequency range from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. So if you imagine that, then imagine that there is a compressor on each of those bands, an individual compressor, complete with ratio controls, thresholds, attack and release, and sometimes knee, where you can manipulate those individual bands or compress them in any way that you see fit or hear fit. And you can play about with those parameters to your heart's content. Now, I've found that a lot of the settings on many of the multiband compressors on the market these days, the ones I'm talking about plugins here, the stock settings, ratio, attack, release, knee, seem to start you off in a very safe place. So you're not causing too many problems for yourselves. And so I wouldn't worry too much about those parameters at the early stages of starting to use a multiband compressor. Multiband compressors are generally considered to have more colour to them than a dynamic EQ, so that could be something to consider. Colour in terms of things like comb filtering, phase anomalies, that kind of thing, due to the crossovers and due to the number of bands you may have chosen to instantiate within your multiband compressor. Let's have a look at the interface so you can get an idea of what it is I'm talking about. Here I've got the Pro MB from FabFilter. I really like this. I really like all the FabFilter plugins. Really easy to understand and operate. It's on a vocal. It's on a lead verse vocal. I've set this up so that I've got 4 bands, and the crossover points, i.e., where one band ends and a new band begins. This band 1-2 crossover is at 100 Hertz. Band 2-3 crossover is at 1000 Hertz. And band 3-4 crossover is at 8 kilohertz. Those splits there work particularly well on a vocal chain. 100 Hertz here and below, which this band is going to compress, will activate or compress signals that go over the threshold set here of those really low kind of subby, rumbly frequencies that you can sometimes get on vocals. Oftentimes the advice with an EQ is to use a high-pass filter to roll off those sorts of frequencies. So that's why that's there for those frequencies if need be. The next band I've set between 100 Hertz and 1000 Hertz. That's quite a large band. But what I'm wanting to control here are the low mids. Depending on how the vocal has been recorded, can end up sounding thick and woolly. The next band, the third band, from 1K up to 8K, that's controlling any kind of nasal frequencies, any pointed frequencies or sharp frequencies, sibilant frequencies, again, which can be a problem with vocals. So it makes sense to set a band around about that area. And then the higher band here, the fourth band, is 8K and above. And again, that's going to be working on any overly sibilant frequencies, which you can often get in the 9K, 10K area on vocals. So again, that's why I've set those bands like that on this vocal multiband. Now, looking at band 1, you see the threshold is at -18, and that's the default threshold that I use for all these points, and then just massage that as I feel is needed on a mix by mix basis, or on a vocal track by vocal track basis. And that's how you decide how much compression or how little compression to add to each individual band. And how much or how little you add comes down to your decision making and how you feel it sounds compared with or played with the rest of the tracks in the mix. So here you can see that you've got an attack and release and an output setting. So that would be like your makeup gain on a compressor. But I very rarely touch these attack and release settings because they just seem to work 99% of the time. I don't hear the multiband working so much that I've got to go in and change the attack and release. So that's what I was saying earlier, where you can just go ahead these days, and the starting point that you're given by plugins is generally one that's not going to get you into trouble. The range here, that is like the maximum compression that you want to apply to any individual range, and you can see that here with this. It's really great on the Fab filter because you can just pull that down as you see fit. But again, generally, just have this set at -6, which is usually the default when you instantiate a new band on this plugin anyway, and that's always been enough. That's decibels, so that's giving you a compression range of -6 decibels in any of those individual bands. Then you've got the ratio control, so this is at 4:1. Now this is a key concept actually, or key difference between a multiband compressor and a dynamic EQ, in that a multiband compressor is using compression and it's using ratios to reduce the frequency band or frequencies, whereas a dynamic EQ is just using gain, like a linear gain, okay? So that's kind of one of the main differences between the two. So that's a quick look at an interface of a multiband compressor. Let's have a look at a EQ. So this, again, Fab Filter. Fab Filter are not sponsoring this video. These are plugins I have bought with my own money. They've not asked me to say nice things about their plugins. I just like using them. So as you can see, this is how I'm using this EQ, and I'm using it in a mixed style, in that I've got a band here that's set at 397.54 Hertz. That is a static EQ band. Whereas here I'm using a dynamic EQ band at 241.83 Hertz. And that, you can see that because of this little kind of arrow here, or these two arrows. And what happens when signal is running through this EQ, 241 Hertz will only be cut when it passes over a certain threshold. So when deciding to implement a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor, what I would suggest is that you would use a multiband compressor to control a broader range of frequencies than you would with a dynamic EQ, which you can really get quite surgical with. And in terms of using both of them, or either of them, it's generally a tool that you would use in a corrective circumstance. As you can see here in this chain, this kind of vocal chain, everything is geared towards reducing certain frequency bands, both in the multiband and in the dynamic EQ. The dynamic frequency here is reducing. That doesn't mean to say that that's how you should use it. Oftentimes, the dynamic, for example, here on this shelf, oftentimes I'll set this as a dynamic EQ so that it's actually boosting dynamically on the upper frequencies, on high frequencies there, to give the impression of a certain amount of air or clarity or sharpness or brilliance to a track. But it's doing it dynamically, so it's not there all the time. It's only when a certain threshold has been passed. And that dynamic boost works to add a little bit of air, freshness, brightness to a mix, to a track, without it being constantly a constant EQ boost. It just does it every so often whenever the threshold is passed. It just sounds more natural. So this vocal chain on this particular mix, I've used several instances of this sort of dynamic control. So we're looking at this lead verse vocal here that's soloed, and you can see that I'm going straight from a tape machine into the multiband compressor here. And this is for corrective reasons. Just wanted to level out the vocal, because with vocal, it's usually I tend to need to control the low frequencies here, the low mids, and sibilant frequencies. So that's there just as the first correction layer on this particular vocal to get things sounding a bit more even. Then that's followed up by the Pro Q3, where that's just doing a little bit more work in those low mids. And then because the low mids are being acted upon in such a way, I felt as though they were starting to sound a little bit thin. So that's why there's a 400 roughly hertz static EQ boost there to make up for that. So once I've done that corrective work there in terms of vocal tone with the multiband compressor and the dynamic EQ, I'll go in and add a compressor. So I've got a nice clean signal going into a compressor or two compressors in series. Following on from that, I'll often use a de-esser, which again is a automatic compressor for sibilant frequencies on a vocal up to 10k or beyond. I'm going to solo this vocal and let you hear what each one of these corrective plugins is doing to the sound. So the first plugin is the multiband compressor.
The Fafig Nugan, I'm far from thinking, don't really know which one.
I bypass it.
The Fafig Nugan, I'm far from thinking, don't really know which one.
Thing I noticed there the most is that sort of pointed frequency that I'm hearing that could be around about 1k, 1.5, 2k area. So that's something I wanted to control. Also, you could see it working here on the lower mids.
The Fafig Nugan, I'm far from thinking, don't really know which one. But that'd still be a boatload of fun. I'm getting older, the water's colder, a shrink in the ocean sun.
So it's fairly subtle, but what's happening is you can just hear the vocal being cleaned up ever so slightly, and it's tapping down on that telephonic aspect of the vocal and the low mid. So that's why that was there. And then I followed that up with the Pro Q3.
The Fafig Nugan, I'm far from thinking, don't really know which one.
You can see it's only applying such a tiny amount there. It's probably 1 dB of gain reduction to that 241 hertz band that I settled on there. I'm going to bypass this and I'll bring it back in again.
The Fafig Nugan, I'm far from thinking, don't really know which one, but they'd still be a boatload of fun. I'm getting older, the water's colder, I shrink in the ocean sun, but my motor's still ready to run.
What you can hear in that particular band, in that plugin as well, in the EQ, is this boost, this 10k boost is adding a kind of a crispness and an air to the vocal. What I like to do, and it's not only something that I've spoken about in past videos in terms of using multiple plugins in series or in a plugin chain that seemingly do the same thing, but that it's that each one does a little bit, so that no one plugin is doing all the work. And by spreading it out like that, I just feel as though it ends up sounding more natural. So that is kind of like the corrective work done on this vocal chain. So following that, I was able to add my 2 compressors, but then I've got a de-esser that's working on, obviously, on the S sound of the vocal. Not only one de-esser, very much because of what I've just explained, I'm using a second de-esser, so 2 de-essers in series on a vocal to naturally tame those S frequencies, both being automatically or dynamically controlled compressors. Lastly, I've used another multiband. Again, don't be afraid to use multiple instances. Don't feel as though you've got to go back to the first multiband and use that. Add another instance of it to tackle a specific frequency trouble spot. And in this case, it's that 2K telephonic or forward nature of that the recording has captured. So let me bypass this and I'll bring it in.
The Fafig Nugan, I'm far from thinking, don't really know which one, but they'd still be a boatload of fun. I'm getting older, the water's colder, I shrink in the ocean sun.
See, you can really hear that frequency that I just wanted to smoothen out, and this does it really well.
The Fafig Nugan, I'm far from thinking, don't really know which one, but they'd still be a boatload of fun.
So that's a typical example of how I use multiband compression and dynamic EQ to tackle problematic frequencies within a recorded track. In this case, it's a vocal, but it could quite easily and often is also in guitars and in keyboards as well. So they're both very similar in operation to each other. There's some slight differences in the actual mechanics of how they work, but the end result that you can get from either or is very similar. Dynamic EQ, you can get in tighter, you can work in tighter bands, in narrower cues, and really get focused and granular with the cuts and with the boosts if you needed to. And a compressor, multiband compressor, sounds more natural when applied across a wide range or a broader range of frequencies. So you could bear that in mind when deciding which one to use. Now, what I'm going to do in a follow-up video is give you my few favourite ways of using a multiband compressor. So I'll expand on this a little bit further so you can see some real practical uses. Multiband compressors, as you will see in a follow-up video, you don't have to use, well, as you've seen here, you don't have to use multiple bands. You can choose to use just one. And there are some pretty useful use cases for using a multiband compressor over a dynamic EQ for those purposes. So subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss that video. If you're interested in learning how I came to the decisions around the multiband compressor and dynamic EQ settings you've seen in this video, then they're taken from my rock mixing masterclass. And if that interests you and you want to really dive in deep and learn more, then you've guessed it, there's a link in the description for you to check that out. So that's all from me in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. That always gives the algorithm a bit of a kick up the backside to perhaps put me in front of a few more people than it does currently. And that would be awesome, so that I could help more people like you mix their own music at home. So until next time, I'll see you in the next